So we're happy tonight to have you both here. Thank you so much for coming. Um, the Norwich Historical Society's mission is to cultivate a vibrant sense of place and community through discovering, preserving, and sharing the history of Norwich. Discovering Norwich was begun during COVID as a way to connect us all to our neighbors and our community. And while the programs feature a wide range of topics from tonight's talk on our distilling and brewing to climate change and flooding, history informs it all. For most of the talks, we're also partnering with other Norwich organizations and businesses, so you get the chance to connect with a variety of other groups as well. The program is a fundraiser for Norwich Historical Society, and as part of our new strategic plan, we're embarking on a new energy efficiency initiatives, and your donations support this work. So thank you so much for your donations. And many, many thanks to the Norwich Inn for partnering with us both last year and this year on this program. It's really been such a delight to share the rich history of the inn in Norwich. So what we're going to do tonight is begin with some history. Then I'm going to share my screen and do a slideshow and just lead you from the apple trees in the woods through time. And then we'll turn it over to Patrick and Tim to be talk to you more about the brewing and the celebration of 30 years of brewing at the end. So let me just get ourselves started with that. Share my screen.
Mute us.
In our presentation. Here we are. So apple trees in the woods. I don't know, I'm sure all of us have driven down the back roads or walked in the woods in the spring or fall and noticed all the apple trees in the woods and by the sides of the road. And they remind me every time I see them of this really beautiful song about a lilac and an apple tree standing in the woods where once a farmhouse stood. It's a beautiful song. And I've always wondered about who planted them and who picked the apples and what they were used for. And recently, while I was reading through Paul Brigham's letters that were located at the University of Vermont, I came across this one, and you'll be really happy. I'm going to read it to you, so you don't have to read it yourselves. Burlington, March 1814. My dear sir, I've directed Mr. Babcock to take some scions from Colonel Buell's orchard. You will have the goodness to acknowledge the receipt of them. I shall always be happy to execute any orders of the kind. It will ever give me pleasure to have it in my power to do anything to promote the cultivation of fruit trees in this state. When the scions shall have grown so as to produce fruit, I will call at Norwich and eat an apple with you. With sentiments of the most perfect respect, I am your sincere friend, Jason Chamberlain. I looked him up today to find out more about him, and he turns out to be a correspondent with Thomas Jefferson. He was at UVM and a professor. But Paul Brigham was an American Revolutionary soldier, the second lieutenant governor of Vermont, and briefly governor of Vermont. And he and Lydia and their 5 children lived on what is today known as Brigham Hill. And the Brigham family continued to live in Norwich for generations, and their apple orchard still flourishes. Here's a photograph of Ernest Brigham pruning the apple trees in the 1940s. And I wonder if this tree is a descendant from one of the scions mailed to Paul in 1814. But the question is, why so many apples? Of course, they were made into pies and sauces, but the vast majority of them were made into cider, which became hard cider. The newspapers are full of advertisements for farms to be rented or for sale, and they almost always mention cider and apples. This farm to be rented, was a half-mile from the meeting house. It had orchards sufficient to make 100 barrels of cider, and it had a good cider mill. It also had the best water brought to the door in lead. And the person who was to rent this place should be industrious, economical, and temperate, with a wife who knows how to make good butter and cheese. But the big piece I wanted to point out was that it had the orchards to make 100 barrels of cider. Norwich diaries are filled with seasonal activities associated with pressing cider. Cider pressing was big business, and each year farmers assembled horse-powered presses to process their neighbors' apples. Take a look at this document. It's from 1850. It's the agricultural census. Every farm in Vermont, in Norwich, has one of these, and it lists how many acres and everything they produce. And that red rectangle is all the value of orchards. Everybody had orchards. Almost every line is filled in because they all were producing apples and cider. Beer was also an important component of the farmer's diet. And this on the right is its advice to the farmer. And it says that the ideal beverage for working in the hot sun is hop beer. And by adding malt, the beer promotes health, exhilarates the mind, and brings cheerfulness and peace. American men of the early 19th century drank far more on average than their modern counterparts. Most New Englanders saw alcohol as giving men the fortification they needed to get through a hard day's work. Cider and beer making were deeply part of the rhythm of the agricultural year, an important part of the diet of Norwich families. While farmers produced their own cider and beer, Norwich stores sold rum, brandy, and wine. So here's a page from Baxter Newton's account book, and this building here at one time was Baxter Newton's store and is today Ledyard Bank. Well, farmers, so in this one, you see men purchasing rum by the half gallon or more, but also stopping by the store to have a pint with friends. And at the store, you could also rent a jug. This rum jug rental is similar to putting a deposit on a glass milk bottle of milk at Dan and Witt's. Here he got 2 gallons of rum and a 4-gallon jug lent. Of course, taverns also sold alcohol. Taverns appeared in Norwich within a few years of its foundings, just as Jasper Murdoch's. They were vital to community life and essential to travel, communication, and the transportation of goods. They were as numerous as meeting houses in New England, and the tavern sign and the meeting house steeple were the two most visible signs of community life. So here we see Norwich. You can see the church right in the center, and Norwich University just to the right of the church. And then going down Main Street, you'll see this more the center of town. Some taverns, including what was to become the Norwich Inn, became stage taverns where the stage coaches would stop to change horses and the passengers could eat and rest. Because they dealt with the entertainment of strangers and the serving of strong drink, taverns were among the most highly regulated of early American enterprises, and innholders had to be certified by the selectmen as men of good character. During the week, farmers regularly stopped at the tavern on their way to the store or the mill to drink a hot toddy at the barroom fire and spend an hour or two talking crops, livestock, and town politics. As the age of reform flourished in the 1820s, the temperance reform movement reached Norwich. And Norwich's story of prohibition and temperance is a story about the prominent role of the town, of the church, town gown relationships, and the organizational skills and the power of women. So the first temperance society was established in the North Parish Church in 1827. But Norwich was never of one mind about temperance. In 1853, when the state legislature proposed a law that would forbid the selling or giving away of intoxicating liquor, Norwich voted 177 to 104 against it. And the deacons had a response to that. Resolved that hereafter no person shall be admitted as a member of this church who shall not engage to abstain from making, selling, or using ardent spirits as a drink or a luxury. But whether or not the resolution held sway is debatable. Why? Because Norwich had another institution at the center of town, Norwich University. And here you can see it in this slide, in this engraving, with the church basically facing Main Street before it was, this was how it was set before it got moved. There was plenty of alcohol being imbibed, whether it was a sip of afternoon brandy with professors, party time with the cadets, or formal functions such as cotillions or military parades. Here you see a list of the toasts drunk at Norwich, Vermont on the 4th of July. Here's one. Our federal union, a cord of 24 threads which Europe is not able to untwine. You see a ticket for a cotillion party at the Union Hotel, where the Norwich Inn is today. Now, the cadets certainly had a good time and certainly had quite a bit of drinking. And I have a story from Christmas time of mummers from 1824. It was written by a young boy named John Hancock. He writes, "We disguised ourselves by blacking our faces with charcoal and candle grease. One had a pair of one had a pair of tongs and a piece of iron to strike between. Another had 2 tin wash basins for cymbals. You can judge the melody we made. We started from the university about 6:00 p.m., went to the tavern." So you can see there in the middle, that's what it would have looked like. A little later, this is a little later in time. Treated to 1 mug of flip. We marched from this place to Mr. Lyman's store. He sent 1 bottle of rum out to us. Mr. Lyman's store, I'm not quite sure if it was this where Ledger Bank is today, but that definitely was a store. Then he says, "Mr. Emerson next brought us to a stand. Here we played several tunes." And Mr. Emerson's house, there were several, but I think it was the one where Carpenter and Main is today. We played several tunes. When we were invited in, I took 1 glass of wine only. They continued down the road. The next house we came to was Mr. Raymond. The young girls looked out the windows and immediately started back with terror and screamed with fright. It being nearly 10 o'clock at night, I thought it best to go to the quarters and did, leaving 4 of them only as much intoxicated as they could be and stand. Throughout much of the first half of the 19th century, it was up to individual towns to vote on whether or not alcohol would be sold in the community. And in 1853, Vermont finally prohibited the production and sale and consumption of alcohol, and that stood until 1903. And one man who was all for this was right here, Sylvester Morris. Here's the inn again, during or right after the Civil War. Once enacted, enforcement of the law was nothing more than law on paper. Enforcement was really difficult. Hard cider, for example, was in a gray area of the state prohibition laws. One could barrel fresh cider. What happened to the cider in the barrel? Well, happened. And the prohibition lasted for 50 years until it was repealed in 1903. And then there were only wet years in Vermont until 1920. So it was a very short amount of time. I just found this pencil sketch today as I was looking for some letters at the Historical Society. I'm not sure the date. The description in our collection, in our archive says, "Dejected young man surrounded by alcohol." So there you go. But it looks like he's at a bar. Maybe this was drawn at the inn. I think it's possible. The Norwich chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed by women concerned about the destructive power of alcohol on families in the community. Some activists felt the only way to enact prohibition would be to give women the right to vote. So the WCTU and the suffrage cause came together. And here's a parade float on Main Street in Norwich. It's just one example of their activities. And it says, "Liquor traffic brings poverty." Oh. Here are those civically minded women who ushered in both prohibition and the right to vote. This is the Norwich Women's Club. And here's one of the projects they worked on, where they were women. The local chapters around the country were urged to erect drinking fountains in their town so that men could get a drink of water without entering saloons and staying for stronger drinks. So our fountain was erected by the WCTU in 1925. And it really is a monument to the role of women in making change. So this would have been a challenging time for the Norwich Inn. And it is said that Ma Walker, the owner of the inn, quietly sold bootleg from the basement. And Tim Wilson, who's here, I was talking to him earlier this week, and he shared with me that there was a trap door in the office where Ma Walker would go down in to get um, moonshine to bring up to sell. Even though Vermont officially supported prohibition, in actuality, independent Vermonters bristled at the federal government's interference in their personal drinking habits. It is said that more people drank more alcohol during the 13 years of prohibition than ever did before or since. Everywhere people helped bootleggers. They hid them in barns from chasing customs agents, covered up, covered over, supported them by making bootlegging a very profitable venture. So here you see a group of law enforcement triumphantly posing for a photo with their confiscated booze. Here's a story of a moonshiner in Norwich from the Beaver Meadow area. His name was Martin Van Buren Easton, and his distillery was a sort of movable affair that was carried back and forth between Norwich and Sharon. And the collector got a hold of him and took him to Newport, where he got bail and is now free again. But that was one moonshiner. Another story of a moonshiner in the area comes from 1894. This is a longer story about a man named Eugene Ilsley, the notorious moonshiner of Thetford. It says he was arrested at midnight Thursday night and has still broken up. The story says, Orange County has long been noted as the home of illicit distillers. The moonshiners live in sparsely settled areas. With their few neighbors bound to them by ties of kinship or complicity, they carry on their operations for years undiscovered and unmolested. Ilsley was the acknowledged leader of moonshining. Over 6 feet tall, with a bushy red beard and a tangled shock of hair, his feats of strength were talked of for miles around. After a careful investigation, the marshals and sheriff met in Sharon. In teams, the party drove over the wild and mountainous roads to Stratford Village, and from there to the home of the moonshiner, who lives on a side road just in the edge of the town of Thetford. The still was supposed to be located in an old deserted house 1.5 miles from the traveled road. At midnight, the party started for the deserted house, and after a hard tramp over a path so rough that to traverse it in daylight would be no easy task, the house was reached. All was dark and still, but the peculiar odor of the distillery assured them they were on the right track. A knock on the door alarmed 2 dogs, whose barking awakened Ilsley, who asked what they wanted. After some parleying, he saw there was no chance to escape, as the officers were fully armed, admitted them to the house, and confessed that he had manufactured a little cider brandy for his own use. It was the work of but a few minutes to locate the still in the cellar. It was a copper still with a doubler, a black tin worm about 50 feet long in a worm tub. The still was found to be half full of partially distilled cider brandy, which was spilled, and the apparatus destroyed. In the cellar were found 18 casks of cider and other evidences that Ilsley had been doing a wholesale business. There are stories of other bootleggers in Norwich. I just received an email today, actually, from Linda Crow, who grew up over on New Boston Road, and she said that there was a still out Ladue Road, and it was out there, and they'd see it when they went hunting. And she says, my grandmother was a very good nature, a very friendly person. But a couple of times over, my grandfather would go out and visit man Sir Kerwin. When he came back, my grandmother was never in a good mood because we knew that Grandpa had been out there sampling the still products that Mansur had. So that was another story from that. But the residents of the neighborhood where Ilsley's still was said that it was the best cider brandy manufactured in Orange County. So, but the frivolity, I would say, that's reflected in this image masks some of the violence that came from Prohibition. So the next time you're in the woods or on a back road and you see an apple tree, think of the farmers in the field quenching their thirst, the deacons and the church women fighting for sobriety, and the bootleggers secretly making their cider brandy, which the neighbors secretly loved. So with that, my stories of Norwich are at an end, and I'm moving. And I've got Tim here, and I've got Patrick, and I'd love it for you to take over.
Alrighty, so we're here to talk about beer. The beer that we brew at the Norwich Inn. It's been going on for not just 30 years, but actually 31 years this year. I am Patrick Dakin. I'm the current brewer. We have always found brewmaster to be a little bit of a misnomer for us, because technically, to be a brewmaster, there's a certain technical, rigorous certification. It's more of a European origin, and I think Mr. Tim will agree that we've always prided ourselves on just being brewers. We're not brewmasters. We make beer. We're not caught up in the science and the technicalities of it, so to speak.
For the most part, we brewed solo, so there was no one to master. Just us.
It's always been a one-man shop. So calling yourself the brewmaster when you actually swab out all the tanks and spend more time cleaning than you do brewing seemed a little pretentious, I thought. People will often say to me, "Oh, you're a brewer. That's so cool. That's the best job ever." And certainly for us, I have to remind them that it's basically a glorified janitorial position. And we would spend 4 days cleaning so that we could do brewing one day. So 4 days of labor for 1 day of love. Next slide, sir. So that's me, Patty the Kilted Brewer, as I refer to myself in the third person often now. And third is also, I'm the second and fourth brewer at the inn. In case you may not be aware, if next slide, Sarah. There's the brewery. It's across the driveway from the pub, from the main building, the original inn. You know, in recent years, as I'm sure everyone knows, there have been bigger buildings, more rooms put up in the back half of the property. But that's the brewery. It was originally a livery building, right, Tim? Not necessarily for horses, but more for storage. Yep. And when Mr. Tim and Sally took over the inn, this building was actually oriented 90 degrees to where it is now.
It came along parallel to the backside of Dan and Witt's, and for a while, Dan and Witt's used it as their feed and grain department. There was a ramp that came down off the back of Dan and Witt's into that building, and that's where they sold their feed and grain. I'm guessing it was before they put that long cinder block addition on the back of Dan and Witt's.
So, Tim, would you like to take a moment to talk to them about the refitting of that building?
Yeah, well, soon after we started selling beer at the inn, it became quite apparent that we were going to run out of beer very quickly. Couldn't produce enough beer to satisfy the growing crowd. And before we even sold our first beer, there were people that followed the issuance of manufacturer's licenses, brewery licenses. And before I produced the first beer, I had people show up from Maine, Connecticut, and Colorado looking for a beer. And I realized that if you told people that you were a brewery and you didn't have beer when they got there, you'd done more harm than good. So very early in the process, we started planning for a much larger brewery, and it took 2 years to convert our little livery building into this building that you see now. In doing so, we took a crane and lifted the building and built a full basement under it, and then set the building down. And we dormered the second floor so that we had room to work up there, and set it back down and completely refurbished the building from top to bottom.
So this is this is obviously what the building looks like during the winter at this point. Next slide, we'll see a summer shot. There you go. That's what it looks like in the summer. So what Mr. Tim was talking about was when he first started brewing, before this building was like this. Next slide, please. He was brewing in 5-gallon containers called carboys. It's a big glass jug, 5 gallons at a time. And the tanks we have now are it's a 4-barrel system, so that we can brew almost 150 gallons of beer at a time. So about 30 times the amount of beer that Mr. Tim started with. And do you still recall, Tim, how many batches you did in this way before the bigger tanks came in?
Yes, I did. In the 2 years that after we started brewing and until the new brewery was ready to go, I brewed 971 5-gallon batches over the 2-year period, which meant that I was brewing every day. Every day was something to do with beer, either brewing or kegging. And we had taken over a little building that was behind what we called the motel. It was a chicken coop that had been converted to an in-law apartment. And we basically pulled the kitchen out and put in a industrial sink and a milk cooler, the kind that you would see in a school for holding milk cartons. And I converted a large closet into a fermentation room by adding an air conditioner and shelves. And I had 26 of these. They were actually 7-gallon carboys in which I brewed 5-gallon batches. So that was about 5,000 gallons of beer that we produced before we actually really got the brewery going. And we sold our first pint of beer to Charlie Hodgson, who was our maintenance man and was a selectman for the town. That was in May of 1993. And somewhere I still have the $5 bill framed that he paid for it with. And here's everybody.
So the first beer was sold in 1993. Does that mean this coming up? Oh no, that's right. It's never mind. I forgot what year it was. Okay, so 31 indeed. 31 indeed. Next slide, please, Sarah. So that's a shot of the inside of the brewery now, in comparison to the 7-gallon jugs that Tim was using to brew 5-barrel batches. Like I said, it's a 4-barrel system. So technically a barrel is 31 gallons. So you should be able to produce 124 gallons, but this equipment is routinely built with extra headspace. So like all good brewers, we would squeeze every gallon we could out of it. And so could produce routinely over 140 and sometimes over 150 gallons of beer at a time. So again, about 30 times what Tim was able to produce when he first started in 1993. So when this brewery started, I did my counting in my head the other day, Tim, and I came up with that Jasper Murdoch's was probably the 5th or the 6th brewery that was licensed in the state of Vermont.
It was the 6th brewery,
The 6th.
and 3rd brew pub.
Yep. And so out of those 6, besides Jasper Murdoch's, the only one that still remains in its original form. I mean, some of them, there's a couple that still carry on, that have been sold, absorbed, et cetera, et cetera. But the only one besides ours that still goes the way it did when it started is the Vermont Pub and Brewery in Burlington, which was started by Greg Noonan. So out of the millions of breweries that are in Vermont now, we were the 6th brewery, and we're now one of the only 2 remaining still standing. So, if that weren't enough to just put everybody to sleep, next picture, please. And that wasn't the one I wanted. Can I have the next one after that, Sarah? There you go. So in the 31 years of brewing, not only are we one of the last men standing, but it is, I think it's unusual in any business, but certainly in this business. What you're looking at are the 3 brewers who have spanned the entirety of the 31 years. That's Tim in the forefront, and Jerry in the middle, and myself in the back. So Tim was first. When he and Sally sold the inn in 2006 to Joe and Jill, I remember it quite well. We were actually on a beer trip together at the time. We were at a cask festival, and he let me in on the secret, because he had been on the phone off and on for days, that they were going to sell the inn. They had a buyer. And of course, my first words should have been, "That's so great for you guys." Instead, it was, "Who's going to make the beer?"
That's when I sprung that on you.
And Tim's response was, "Do you know anybody stupid enough to take the job?" And in fact, he was sitting next to him. So we've got 31 years of brewers in this picture. And what started as a 3-tap bar. Now, if you could go back one, Sarah, I think I mixed these up a little. We've grown now. It's an 8-tap system, and it includes a couple of guest taps, which is another sign of the times. When the brewery first started, and Tim was making this beer, as I said, it was a 6th brewery in Vermont. Your choices were limited, as they were in all of the U.S. at the time. Brew pubs had just barely been licensed in Vermont, and it was the start of this thing that we know now as a driver of tourism and economics, not just for Vermont, but for a lot of America. And in the beginning, Tim brewed what he knew, and those were English ales. And that's the history of early brewing in America, as well as Vermont, came from home brewing. And that's where all the brewers came from. They came through the pipeline. They had started brewing in their kitchens, in their basements, in their sheds. And in Tim's case, it moved to the chicken coop. And that's where brewers came from. Brewing has evolved to the point today where it's hard for a guy who is just a home brewer to break into the industry. Any number of colleges and major universities have have actual brewing programs where folks sign up and they study biochemistry and the business of brewing and how do you run a brewery and how do you make it work both technically, financially, and so the three guys that you saw in that picture all came through that pipeline of starting as home brewers. We all brewed in our kitchens to begin with, and then we moved on to the big house, so to speak. Taste change. You'll notice in these taps, if you can read them, I can tell you that there's out of these 8 taps, there are at least 4 of them that are hop forward beers. And frankly, that's an anomaly. You can go into many brew pubs and breweries and bars these days, and if you have 10 taps, 8 of them will be IPAs. The tradition at the inn has stayed true to a balanced lineup, and the form is we try not to give in too much to fad. We cave to evolution, but not to faddism. And so the beers that you get there, some of the recipes, including the Whistling Pig, which is always on tap, are beers that have been made there maybe for 30 years. There are still some of those legacy recipes that I use that came out of Mr. Tim's head and were written down by Mr. Tim's hand. And if they have changed, it's been a tweaking along those 30 years. So the longevity and the resiliency of the inn, I think, is really remarkable in the industry. It's hard to find. It's hard to find that kind of continuity. It's hard to find just 3 guys who have brewed beer for 31 years and who still talk to each other and actually like each other. I will say that COVID has changed the inn and the brewing, like in many places. It was a close run thing, to be honest, whether the brewery would even survive the pandemic. Jer had to leave, and there's no brew to be made. The pub wasn't open for months and years at a time, basically, with the off and on. And he was unable to wait it out, and he had to leave. I came back on a part-time basis just to keep the doors open. But it wasn't a given that the brewery was going to survive COVID and the changes in habits and tastes of the consumer. So, but we've made it, and we're here, and we're still brewing beer on a regular basis, and it's still on tap every day. Have I missed things, Tim?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
It's run a little shorter than I had anticipated, but I think we've covered the majority of it. Happy to take questions and comments at this time.
We do have one question here. What is something unexpected that you wish we knew about brewing?
Something unexpected. Well, I can tell you one of the beauties of brewing in a one-man shop on such a small system, where the beer does not go anywhere else. So there's no off-site distribution from the inn. You can take beer away in bottles or growlers or in your belly, but you're not going to find it on a grocery store shelf or at Danowitz or anything. And so I'll let you in on a little secret, and that is sometimes, because we work small, we don't have a pilot brewery, because a pilot brewery would be our size. Occasionally a beer doesn't turn out the way you planned, which is the surprise. The pleasantry of it is that nobody knows that except me. So I changed the name that I intended. I changed the description that I intended. And I've got a new beer. The beers we make are not always what we intend, but they're always by far good enough to drink.
Mark asks, how many barrels do you make a year?
Well, at our peak, before at the end of Mr. Tim's reign, and when I started, and for the first, for probably close to a good 10 years after that, we were brewing over 200 barrels a year, between 200 to 220 barrels. In the post-COVID era,
Very small.
which very small.
Yeah.
I mean, you used to claim at one time that we were the smallest brewery in America. I'm not. I think you made that up.
I'm sure at one point we were.
Okay. But in the post-COVID scenario, we are just not. First of all, the landscape has changed. The world has changed under our feet. There are more breweries than you can shake a stick at, and Vermont, for years and years now, has led the nation in per capita breweries. We have more breweries per capita than any state in the union, and have, I think, for at least a decade, if not longer. And with the other difficulties of staffing a kitchen and servers and hours and all the things that every restaurant will tell you about, we now produce about half of what we did at peak. So down to about 100 barrels a year right now. But if you all drink more, we could fix that.
Most breweries, even in Vermont, would count their production more in thousands of barrels. Wouldn't you agree, Patrick?
Oh, I think just about every other brewery would.
Yeah.
Even among small breweries, we're small.
Yep.
Yeah. Being attached to an inn and having no distribution whatsoever really limits it. That's what part of the charm and part of what makes us special.
All right, the questions keep flooding in. What's the
Good.
story behind the name Jasper Murdoch?
Pardon me?
Tim?
What's the story behind the name Jasper Murdoch?
Oh, well, Jasper Murdoch was really the founder of the Norwich Inn when he built a grand home at the current site of the inn. And shortly after started taking in guests, and it became known as a tavern and a stage tavern, as Sarah described it early on. He was a colonel in the local militia. He responded to the raid on Royalton, the Indian raid on Royalton, and he was a prominent citizen in the very early years of the town.
Well, and that leads into how do you choose the names of the other beer flavors?
That's the most fun.
That is the absolute most fun of the job. I still have a list, and I bet Tim still has a list that
I still have a list
from his days as a brewer here of potential beer names. There are just things that occur to you, funny thoughts, odd combinations of beers. It's like when you're sitting around and somebody said something weird, and one other person in the group will say, that would make a great band name. Well, that's what brewers do. You get on a riff, or you get talking silly, so it all comes out of our fertile imagination. That's where the beer names come from. And sometimes
that's where Whistling Pig comes from?
Oh, no, that is a history.
What's that?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Oh,
Whistling Pig.
Whistling Pig. That is a name that that I first used when I was asked to make a batch of beer for a wild game party that was held on Groundhog Day. And Groundhog is one of its nicknames is Whistle Pig. And since this was first brewed for a Groundhog Day party, I thought Whistling Pig was too good a name to waste. So, and it was an Irish red ale style. And so I called it Whistling Pig Red Ale, and I still make that beer today, as does Patrick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I had it just on Tuesday night. Okay. Let's see. Do you see any seasonal variation in the growth of the yeast?
And the growth of these, no, it's no, I would say it's pretty consistent. There's not a lot of, because the tanks we use are temperature controlled. They all have they're stainless steel, and they're jacketed with glycol, which is a food grade coolant. And during fermentation, it's an exothermic process. So during fermentation, it gives off a lot of heat. So the tanks are chilled to maintain a steady fermentation temperature. We have electronic controllers that control the flow of the coolant, and it keeps the fermentation within a 2-degree plus or minus range of where we want that to be. So I suppose there could be variations seasonally if you were brewing in a more uncontrolled environment, but we have pretty tight control on the fermentation temperature. So no.
Yeah.
All right.
When I was brewing at the chicken coop, it was a challenge, which is why I had to install an air conditioner in that closet where I kept all the beer. But yeah, temperature is very important, and temperature control is critical, and that's why we have good controls on all of our vessels.
The questions keep coming. What's your favorite Jasper Murdoch brew?
What do you think, Patrick?
Well, my pat answer is always, that's like asking me which one of my children is my favorite. But I think, honestly, my favorite Jasper Murdoch beer is still the Stackpole Porter, which is a tin recipe that I continue to make to this day. It's hands down the best porter I've ever had.
It's named after my 7th great grandfather, who owned a pub in Maine in 1693, which was 300 years before, or 1693, 300 years before we served our first beer.
And what's yours, Tim?
I still have a soft spot for Whistling Pig. But we make a seasonal beer at Christmas time that's pretty special, private stock.
Yeah.
That we usually add a lot of toffee notes to make it celebratory for the Christmas season.
Frank Dolan has a question for you. Maybe this is for Tim, I'm not sure. At one time, bottled beer was being sold out the back door of the inn. What was going on with that?
Well, we did want to have,
My office.
I've always considered the beer to be for the benefit of our guests, but we wanted our guests to be able to take some home with them when they left. And so we started to bottle the beer and sell it. But because of liquor regulations, it had to have a separate license for retail sales, and they required that it have a separate entrance from the pub. And so what we did is we took a room off of the office and we put in a Dutch door so that we could open the top and hand the beer out into the alley.
And I
Okay.
will tell you, those regulations have changed, so now we're easily able to pass the beer over the front desk to folks that want to buy it. and that's been in place for a number of years now. But we still get people who pine for the days and ask if they can get the beer out the back door again.
I see one final question, and then I'm gonna open it up for anyone else who wants to just say hi to you, because I'm sure they'd like to say hi. How have people's taste changed over the years?
Hops.
Hops.
Yeah. Hops have come to dominate the industry. You know, there are a lot of other threads or currents that gain strength and wane a little bit. And frankly, when the hop thing started, Tim and I both said, "Oh, this will never last. I mean, this is just another. They'll get sick of this." Well, they haven't gotten sick of it.
No.
You know, I think thankfully we've gotten past the point where the measure is simply the number of IBUs or how bitter the beer is, which at one point was all anyone was striving for. It's like, how many hops can we pack into each container of beer? So I think thankfully we've moved past that, and it is more about flavor and aroma and enjoyment instead of just the burn. But as somebody who frankly personally just is not a hophead, you know, IPA is not my first choice, nor my second. It has made the landscape a little difficult for us.
At the moment, I happen to be in Palm Springs, California, and I can tell you it's the same here. I think it's safe to say it's the same everywhere in the US right now. Personally, I prefer balance. So I like hops as much as the next person, but I like to be able to taste the malt too. So I tend to balance out malt and hops and other flavors.
I just want to thank you both so much. Those are all the questions. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share with the group? And then I'm going to open it up for people to just say hi if they want to say hi. But thank you so much. Any final?
No, final thought is beer makes me happy, and I hope it makes you happy too.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For those of you who are still here, next week, Discover Norwich is all about Norwich trees. We're going to be with the Conservation Commission and the Windsor County Forester, and they're going to talk about grants that are available to help you with your woodlands, learn how to assess the health of your trees, identify trees. And we're going to talk about landscape change through time in Norwich as well. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much to Patrick and Tim. And I'm going to have people, you know, say hi if they'd like to say hi. I have Liz Blanchfield who's raised her hand. So if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, and if anyone wants to unvideo themselves and let their face come out and say hi to Tim or Patrick, feel free to do so. Okay. Hi, Judy.
I just want to say thank you to both of you because I've enjoyed beer over the years. Tim, you got it going. Tim, did you have a hard time letting go and moving on?
Well, after
Sally, stop laughing.
after 17 years, it was nice to get a bit of a break, and we did some traveling, and I never stopped brewing. I'm still brewing Whistling Pig in my basement, and lots of other beers too.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I can also say that at the height of our powers, so to speak, when we were putting out as much beer as we were, I've never loved a job any more than that. But given the demands of doing that in a one-man shop, it was still a cage. It was a gilded cage, but as I think Tim was suggesting, it was hard to escape. There wasn't a lot of room for error, wasn't a lot of room for stepping back.
Yep.
Well, we appreciate you then so much.
Thank you.
You.
Bravo to you both.
Yeah. I still
Say
like Whistling Pig.
hello to Sally, Tim.
Hi.
Wonderful to see you.
Sally's here with me.
Oh, good.
She's lurking in the background here.
Maybe she'll come forward.
Maybe she will.
She did come forward. I
Yeah.
catch her lips.
She's camera shy, I'm afraid.
She was peeking over her shoulder earlier. So
Great. All right. Well, I just want to say again, thank you so much. It's so great to be able to partner with the Inn. This is our second year with you guys, and we always learn more. And you're such a centerpiece of our community that we're really so glad you're here. And thank you for all that you do for the town.
And thank you for keeping history alive.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next week. Have a good night.
take care, all.
Thank you,
All
Sarah.
right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Love that.